Hi, I'm the Amateur Logician from amateurlogician.com. In this video, we're going to explore how various kinds of biases can make us reason and think illogically. To combat them, to think more objectively requires us to first recognize these biases. Now, not all these biases we will look at are psychological tendencies, yet that will be a focus. We're going to cover such biases as cognitive biases, and we're going to roughly subdivide these various types of biases. We're going to categorize them. There's going to be some overlap. And to be sure, this is not exhaustive by any means, but it's a good first approach, I think. We'll talk about memory biases, but also how we can combat these various types of biases. We'll talk about statistical and methodological biases, social and behavioral biases. We will consider decision-making biases, and also philosophical biases. Now, studying logic should help us think more rationally, right? For example, when learning about the common logical fallacies, those should help us avoid errors in reasoning. When we spot a logical fallacy, we spot a bad argument where the evidence provided does not lead to the stated conclusion. And I have several references on my website, amateurlogician.com, on important fallacies like the ignorato-elenchi fallacy, the petitio principii fallacy, and more. And I also have some videos on this YouTube channel as well. Now, another important thing to consider deals with psychological tendencies that can lead us to think irrationally. These are cognitive biases, for example. And as I said, a first step to combat such tendencies is to recognize they exist and to be able to identify them, because once we can identify them, we're relatively less likely to fall into them. So let's try to recognize these tendencies, and next, let's try to objectively evaluate our own arguments and our own feelings to see if we are falling into them. Now, cognitive biases deal with our thinking patterns, our judgments, and we can roughly subdivide these into information or belief biases, biases based on pattern or probability, cognitive biases dealing with self-evaluation, and also temporal and value distortion. So let's start with information or belief biases. There is confirmation bias. That's a tendency to only seek information and arguments that confirm our already existing beliefs. The problem, of course, is that this shields us from really evaluating other beliefs, and it shields us from confronting evidence and arguments that might actually contradict our beliefs. Since we're all fallible and liable to error, we have to be open-minded enough to consider alternatives. So how do we fight confirmation bias? Seek multiple sources of information. Play devil's advocate with yourself. Look at your opponent's arguments and evidence. John Stuart Mill, the logician and political philosopher, once said that, hey, if you cannot give the arguments of the opposing side, don't think your own views are as powerful as you think. We have availability bias, and that deals with judging the likelihood of something by how easily we can think of examples and evidence to support it. But of course, this may only be due to a failure on our part. Relatedly, there is the anchoring bias. This is a bias where we put too much stock on what we first encounter. I encounter evidence that suggests X is the case, and then close myself off to future evidence that might contradict X. The positive outcome bias, while perhaps better fitting in other categories, can be placed here too, to be sure, is a belief that expects favorable results more often than is realistic. If you or I lean towards this bias, we have to seek outside help to help us evaluate things more realistically. Now, that also can deal with self-evaluation. And another type of self-evaluation bias is the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's paradoxical, but especially comes into play with controversial subjects like in politics or religion. Individuals who are not well studied in these subjects oftentimes have a stronger confidence in their beliefs versus, interestingly enough, those who are well studied. Think of the so-called new atheists. Their studies of so-called natural theology are so superficial to render their opinions totally worthless. But they have a very, very strong opinion on the subject nonetheless. There's also the overconfidence bias, where someone has an excessive confidence in one's own judgments or abilities. We have temporal and value distortion biases. For instance, there's hyperbolic discounting. And that deals with a preference of immediate rewards over larger delayed rewards. In economics, this deals with what is called time preference. Other things being equal, people prefer a present good to the same future good. That's why people loan to each other at interest. Now, the thing is, any advanced civilization really requires us to delay instant gratification so as to sustain investments that only bear more fruit in the future. You have this extensive capital structure in an advanced economy, but hyperbolic discounting, so to speak, ignores this. Irrational escalation is also known as the sunk cost fallacy. Someone continues a failing course of action simply due to the past investment in it. He might have put a lot of time, effort, and money into a losing project, but he thinks because he has put so much in it, he cannot quit now, even though it actually might be the right and objective thing to do. Another popular bias is loss aversion. We feel that losses are more significant than equivalent gains. This is a common feeling when it comes to stock market investment. It can really lead us to act too emotionally in investing. Other cognitive biases deal with pattern or probability recognition or evaluation of probability. I have an entire video on the so-called gambler's fallacy. Basically, it's a false bias that past random outcomes affect future ones. So, because I keep losing when I play the Powerball, it seems to be the case that I now have a better chance to win it. But that's totally fallacious. In fact, I'm just as unlikely now to win as I was before. Representativeness heuristic deals with judging a probability by how it resembles some generalization in a rash manner. Okay, so basically it's making a snap judgment. So these are various types of cognitive biases. As I said, this is not exhaustive, and this is just a rough categorization scheme. There's overlap and so forth, but it's a good start. And I would suggest play devil's advocate with yourself. Identify your own biases, seek multiple sources of information, don't assume you know everything, learn from others, and be open-minded but critical. Now, there are different types of memory biases as well. For example, there's hindsight bias. It's a belief that judges a past event as more predictable after it occurred. Oh, that's obvious, that had to occur. Well, maybe. It often seems like that after the fact, but not before it. It's very easy to fall into hindsight bias, and I have done so myself on several occasions. The peak end rule is another memory bias. It's a bias that judges an experience by its most intense moments or its ending. So in that sense, it might not be objective. So to be objective, we need to consider the entire experience. We should try to do that in any case as best as possible. False memory effect happens more than we like to admit, I suppose. That's a bias that distorts what we remember. We might remember an event different than how it really occurred. Perhaps the false memory was motivated by the peak end rule or wishful thinking or whatnot. Again, this categorization scheme is rough and there are overlaps. But in any case, when it comes to decision-making biases, we've already talked about hyperbolic discounting and the sunken cost fallacy, but let's add some more stuff here. There is the status quo bias. There's the omission bias, where someone views harmful inaction as less bad than equally harmful action. There's the choice supportive bias. That deals with remembering one's past choices as better than they were. We're also just good at rationalizing past bad actions, unfortunately. We should try to, so to speak, take a third-person point of view to evaluate ourselves, to say, hey, did we do something right or did we do something really wrong? What is our objective state of affairs? And so on and so forth. The framing effect could also fit under statistical and methodological biases. It can fit here too because decisions can be influenced by how information is presented in a tendentious way. It fits with statistics because surveys and polls often have loaded language to encourage wanted responses. There's that framing effect. And with that, let's jump into statistical and methodological biases. We have a sampling bias, for example, and that deals with samples that are not representative of the population at large. A good sample, on the contrary, should mirror the population at large. That's what makes it useful in inferential statistics, where we can actually talk about the population as a whole, even though we only have a sample. Along those lines, there is selection bias. That's when we study participants who are not representative of the population at large. There is survivorship bias. That's when there's a focus only on successful cases, ignoring failures. For example, we can imagine a company reporting on their supplements in this manner. We can also consider measurement bias. This is not a psychological tendency, obviously, but it's a type of bias that deals with faulty measurement, the use of faulty measurement. It distorts reality. Recall bias on past events can happen. People can be selective on what they reveal to someone asking questions to them based on such things as social desirability. People are known not to tell their vices. Socially unacceptable behavior can be underreported thereby. There's also publication bias that refers to the tendency that studies with positive results are more likely to be published. Ironically, of course, the news is different. Negative news is bigger news in a manner of speaking. And before I forget, let's talk about social and behavioral biases, which I actually should have done a little bit earlier before the statistical methodological stuff, but that's all right. Okay, so here we're talking about biases that are influenced by social perception, group belonging, interpersonal judgment, so to speak. So when we're talking about group-based bias, there's in-group bias that is favoring members of one's own group. It doesn't have to be like an ethnic group or a racial group by any means. It could just be a political group, right? So I'm belonging to this particular political group, so I see all others as outsiders, as the enemy, so to speak, and I don't really evaluate them objectively because I don't like their politics or whatnot. This affects a lot of people, and I think in today's day and age, it affects all of us to some extent, so we have to be very careful here. There's stereotyping, that is assuming traits of an individual based on group membership in a very superficial manner. There's various interpersonal biases. For example, there's a halo effect. Let's say someone just looks better, is more attractive, and we thereby judge their input as having more worth than it really should. Or on the other hand, we're just focusing in on the negatives that person has and dismissing them. And of course, there's this authority bias that we can also get into. And this is definitely a psychological tendency. There's been tests on this where people will, unfortunately, if they're not self-reflective, follow authority figures to do actually very bad things. For example, like shock someone. We'll think about some philosophical biases. So with philosophical biases, we have, for example, anti-metaphysical bias. And perhaps the biggest example is scientism. Scientism is an anti-metaphysical bias that assumes that only the scientific method yields real knowledge. Yet, on further inspection, this view is self-defeating. The scientific method cannot be proven with the scientific method. Mathematical truths themselves are not proven by the scientific method. Yet physics and chemistry and so forth presuppose mathematics. Scientism dismisses metaphysics, but there will always be metaphysical presuppositions that physics and other sciences have. You really cannot escape metaphysics at the end of the day. Verificationism is a related bias that views only empirically verifiable statements as meaningful. Like before, this view is totally self-defeating. This view itself is not empirically verifiable. Also consider, for example, ethical, moral statements. Those are meaningful, though they're not empirically verifiable. We have the nominalism bias, and I have a lot of videos on that. The nominalism bias rejects the power of abstraction to reach universal concepts. This bias is, in a way, a bias against traditional logic and the so-called first act of the mind, where man can indeed form ideas. But the skeptic crushes our genuine ability. Language itself couldn't function if we all stuck to a world of particularity. There's the concrete thinking bias. It's a preference for only material and observable explanations. There's reductionism that wants to reduce everything down to, so to speak, an atomic structure, but not everything works based on that kind of principle. Other biases include the pragmatic bias. Pragmatic bias takes a view that if it isn't directly useful, it isn't worth thinking about. And related to that is the anti-theoretical bias that is against theorizing and abstraction. The Whig theory of history is a big bias. It sees history as an inevitable progressive march, but history is far more complicated than that. There's ups and downs for sure. And finally, we have secular bias, which is anti-religious. It doesn't even take into consideration religious arguments. It just dismisses them offhand without giving them a serious look. It doesn't take seriously our spiritual side, and so on and so forth. So this has been a preview of various biases. Like I said, this is not exhaustive, and there's overlap between the different categories and so forth, but I think it's a good first approach, a first attempt to classify biases. Now, I am the Amateur Logician from amateurlogician.com. I hope you found this video interesting, useful, helpful perhaps. If you like this video, please consider giving it a like. If you haven't already, subscribe to my YouTube channel and visit my website, amateurlogician.com. Thanks for your viewership. I appreciate it a lot. Good luck to you and be well.